My name is Charlotte Chedeville. I'm the Senior Project and Program Manager at CIPD in the Middle East. And today I'm delighted to be your host. I see a couple of people are back from previous sessions. Today we'll be discussing how to reinvent learning and skills for ourselves and our organizations. We'll talk about the intersection of technology and skills, the learning agenda, and a lot more things. My guest today is Caroline Gladwin. She's the Executive Solution Director for HCM at Oracle. And this webinar is presented in collaboration with our partners at Oracle. So I hope we'll dive into the topic in a little bit. Meanwhile, let me do some housekeeping introductions. So you can use the chat or the Q&A button if you wish to submit any question. Please do so. Let us know if what we're saying is being helpful. If it's not, if there is anything else that you need to know from us. And let us know right now, right down below, where you're joining us from. What are you hoping to get from today's session so that I can ask the right questions to Caroline as well and ensure that we give you as much as we can. Post-session, so I'll try and take as many questions live as I can. If you are asking questions that we'll cover in a little later throughout the session or that we haven't planned to cover at all, we've kept some time for questions at the end of today's session, which will be exactly an hour. And if there is something that we haven't had the chance to cover, don't worry, we'll do so later. Post-webinar, you'll receive further information and also the recording of today's session if there is anything that you wish to go back to, but please do stay with us. It's always much nicer when you're live with us. So before we get started, I'd like to introduce Caroline. Caroline, what I found really interesting about your profile is, well, you know, how you got into HCM in the first place and what you're passionate about. I'll let you perhaps start by introducing yourself.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be with you all. I'm looking forward to today's conversation. So, yeah, I've been at Oracle about 20 years. Prior to that, actually, I worked for a number of UK companies. So I'm talking to you today from Liverpool in the UK. So it's still the morning for me, actually. But so my background is very much around looking at how technology could help the organizations I was working for deliver the business outcomes. And I then transitioned across to Oracle. And actually, at Oracle, I've worked in a number of different areas. So I haven't always been HR. I've also had experience across areas like procurement and finance, but particularly analytics. So you asked about my passion. I suppose my real passion is in terms of how data can really help every organization do things better. So very much kind of evidence-based HR, the whole concept of nudging managers and leaders in an organization to make evidence-based decisions rather than go on what they've always done or gut feeling is an area that really fascinates me. And also that kind of linking into the whole skills employee engagement agenda of how data can really help both the individual but also the organization really move forward in, you know, the very uncertain times that we're working in at the moment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Caroline. I think it's particularly important to note because many of you have been attending these sessions since the beginning of the pandemic when we launched them. We've thought a lot about what kind of partners we wanted to bring onto these sessions and what kind of content we wanted to bring forward. And we've been working with Oracle in the background now for a couple of months. And with Caroline, what we've really discussed is the importance of data and how this links not just to the profession, but also more specifically speaking at the CIPD. You know that we've got the CIPD profession map, that business acumen and being evidence-based are huge, very, very important skills for HR professionals today and tomorrow. And so these are some of the points that have been interesting for us, but also the fact that in addition to Caroline's expertise by herself, I think the amount of clients that you work with throughout the region and globally is really just, for me, what was interesting has been the wealth of stories that you've got to share, and we'll get into some of these today. When you first told me, when you first introduced yourself to me in our prep call, Caroline, you told me everything starts and ends with data. And I thought that was a really, really good starting point for today's session. What do you mean by that? And why do skills matter in comparison to that?
Yeah, so in terms of everything starting and ending with data, I think for too long, HR was actually quite low down in the priorities of getting budget and focus in terms of people data. So I think if I look traditionally at HR departments, they maybe didn't have the same voice that, you know, the customer facing roles did, or the other parts of the organization, finance did, in terms of getting that real insight to the data. But I think what we're seeing increasingly is that data, if you start from data, it can break some of those preconceptions you have around, if we look at the skills agenda, around what skills do you actually have, what's the impact, for example, of the training and learning that you're doing in terms of developing those skills, how are those skills then feeding into the business outcomes that you're trying to deliver. And if you look at a lot of HR departments, historically over time spent a lot of effort trying to create competency frameworks and skills catalogs and trying to do something with those. And actually that can be quite difficult to really show the value of that if you don't have that theme of data running all the way through. So that's why I always think everything starts and ends with data, because if you can start from an evidence-based position and you can then take some actions to show the impacts of those, then HR is going to continue to be that trusted partner to the business, really helping the business achieve those outcomes. And the skills agenda is a classic one where there's a huge amount of data and it can be quite daunting to think about how can we start to look at that data. But actually with some of the more modern ways of doing data analysis and using that rich set of data alongside all of the other attributes you know about your people and all of the stuff you know about what you're trying to achieve as an organization, you can really begin to sort of change cultures, change behaviors, but also drive those better outcomes that you're looking for, I think.
Yeah, I think we'll unpack that a bit, but I think that's really interesting. And I'd love to hear from everybody who's on the session today. Do you believe that your organization is using data in the right way and enough data to support HR processes, and is it aligned? Meanwhile, the title of the session is Skills Matter. In your opinion, and we'll start with that, with data interwoven throughout this conversation, why is this topic becoming more prominent in HR conversation today? And what do you think the past year has changed for the skills agenda?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, Charlotte. So a lot of my job is talking to HR leaders about how can they better implement their people strategies and how can technology help them. And I think what we've all seen in the last 12 to 24 months is a massive period of reset in effect. So everything is significantly different now to where it probably was a couple of years ago. We've got an awful lot of things like hybrid working. We've got employees needing to feel both physically safe, but also sort of mentally safe and have a safe space in which to work, however that wants to be for them. We've got things like hybrid working that we probably never dreamed would become so prevalent in such a short period. But we've also got the business challenges of businesses having to pivot in the way that they deliver their services and changing their operating models almost overnight. And then the sort of third prong, if you like, is the technology uncertainty of the rise of AI and people wanting to really take advantage of where technology can do not only the heavy lifting, but also some things that we just can't do as humans. That, AI is incredible in terms of being able to identify insights as well. So there's all that sort of uncertainty. And from an HR point of view, I think it's created a real opportunity. I mean, it's been a period where people have responded just incredibly. I mean, some of the stories you hear of the way organizations have pivoted, employees are doing jobs they never thought they'd do, and they've just had to do them because of the circumstances. So I think we're in a situation now where we want to try and take all the positives of that agility that we've seen in the last couple of years, but have HR departments really see this as an opportunity to potentially reset and to take advantage of that stronger voice that most HR leaders now have at a board level, and that understanding from all of the business leaders now of how important people are to being able to deliver what the business wants to achieve, and therefore the importance of understanding and identifying what those skills are going forward that's going to help that business be successful in this new kind of digital and post-COVID period that we're going to go into.
There are a few things I want to rebound on, but the last point that you've made, in your experience and from the research that you guys have done, what have you seen to be the most important skills coming forward? And I'm sure that's a question that a lot of people are expecting us to answer today. And it's not as easy as that. Obviously, it will depend on your geography, will depend on your industry. and on the level of maturity of the organization as well. But overall, are you seeing some key trends in the skills that are being needed as a result of all the changes that have happened recently?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Charlotte. It's very difficult on a session like this to go into anything too specific, because probably every attendee on this call, the skills that their organisation need will be slightly different depending on what location, what industry, what type of organisation you are. But I think if we sort of elevate that upper level, if I look at the conversations I'm having, the research we've done, there's an awful lot of focus in HR in terms of ensuring that organizations have the organizational capability they need to deliver their business outcomes. And, that sort of element of managing that potential risk to the business of not having the right skills is really important. And given the pace that those skills are changing at, HR departments are having to be so agile now in terms of things like strategic planning, in terms of things like talent reviews, identifying high potential groups of employees who are ready to be developed into that next level, but doing it in an equal and an inclusive way. So there's a lot going on in terms of strategically where HR is sitting. And that's translating, what I'm seeing is in 2 or 3 key areas. So definitely there's a much greater focus on leadership skills at all levels in the organization. I think in periods of uncertainty and periods of change, most organizations put quite a lot onto their managers in terms of driving that change through the organization. And I think traditionally there was a danger that organizations recruited managers more in terms of who was best at that particular job. So it was seen as almost a reward for being good at your job. You then became the manager and got the extra money and kudos that reflected. But increasingly what I'm seeing is organizations recognizing that actually leadership and management is a skill in its own right. And they're trying to identify the people with the best person skills, people management skills, to go into those management roles. But those people who want to remain as an individual contributor and just be really, really good at the role they're doing, or to progress their career in that way, that's still recognized as a perfectly valid way of developing your skills. So there's an awful lot at the moment in terms of management skills about the people management, the kind of almost like the emotional intelligence, the ability to help employees who are maybe feeling unsettled. They may be worried about coming back into a workplace, or they're worried about the uncertainty that, AI in their mind is maybe raising. Am I going to have a job in 2 years' time? What do I need to do to be safe in my particular role? So that whole area of leadership skills, I think, is one area that most organizations I talk to are having a real focus on. I think the other area, which is really interesting, is the extent to which you can empower and enable and also kind of encourage your employees to want to develop their own skills and to develop their own career and take ownership of that. And I think a lot of that is sort of linked into the broader employee engagement agenda as well, where, organizations need to make it much easier for employees to share what skills they have, but they also, in my opinion, need to make much better use of technology to almost make suggestions and recommendations and, other hints to employees of, do you not think that you have this skill based on the fact you did a short-term gig, or you've mentored somebody, or you've worked with people and gained experience? So I think there's a whole area as well around how do you ensure that your employees can more easily identify and understand what skills they have, but also understand the benefits of them developing those skills so that they have that kind of career development scenario as well. I mean, I could go on, but that's
I'll cut you here because there is so much to unpack that I don't want to miss out on. I'm just thinking where to start with lots of points. I think the first thing that you've talked about in terms of skills, we've seen, you're right, the emergence of really emergence, or at least a strengthening in terms of the focus around soft skills and vulnerability and leadership. And we've seen that that's what made company really stand out during the crisis and actually fare really well. Now, that being said, you've talked about a lot of different skills, which we know are going to be very different company to company and department to department. And going back to being evidence-based, we can't just go and say, well, organizations don't want to be, and I think, at a stage where you're trying to guesstimate what you're going to need in a couple of years. And it's also very difficult, and Priya is making a great point, she's one step ahead of me, but she's saying HR departments get so bogged down with the day-to-day running of the departments that it is actually really difficult to conduct an analysis of what skills the workforce has, not just the skills that they're using, but the additional skills that we might not be capitalizing on. And also then she's talking about the evolution of staff throughout the career, but we'll get to that point a bit later. But so my question to you, in our first discussion, you talked to me about starting with the skills taxonomy, so to say. So yeah, exactly how, how can technology help? And we'll then talk about the stigma around technology. But B, where do we start? Where do we start to know what we've got first and what we might be needing in a couple of years' time?
Okay, so in terms of the actual kind of taxonomy, in my opinion, that's where technology can really help. So if you, I mean, obviously I work for Oracle. If you take Oracle as an example, and there are other vendors out there doing, you know, similar things, but if you take Oracle, then what we have access to now is a huge amount of both publicly available data around jobs and skills and descriptions and what people are looking for. But we also have the ability using AI to marry that with the local data that a particular organization has. So for me, the taxonomy becomes a living and breathing thing that says, okay, well, these are the skills out there in the market publicly available. And, you know, we will create a taxonomy and a skills catalog around that. But as we know, every organization describes things slightly differently. They have their own terminology. And therefore, what you want is the engine to be able to take the publicly available, combine it with the locally available, and give HR departments a view that reflects their organization and their skills. And if you layer on top of that the ability for HR to manually add the skills of the future that they can identify their organization's going to need, but aren't necessarily clearly visible in the existing or the historical data, then you're suddenly got to leave that sort of living and breathing skills taxonomy that gives you a great place to start. And I'm sure we'll come on in a second to talking a little bit more about how we can use that. But to your second point of where do you start? If you have the assumption that you're going to allow technology to do the heavy lifting of creating that skills catalog, then in my opinion, where you start as an organization and as an HR leadership team is you start by identifying which is the business outcome that you're trying to influence. And let me give you an example. So I'm working with a UK organization at the moment, and about 2 years ago, they made the decision that as a business, they needed to sell far more through their online channel than their retail stores. Now, what they did was they sat down and thought, okay, well, our business outcome is increased online sales. What are the capabilities as an organization we need to deliver that? And they came up with things like, much better supply chain to be able to get the products out quickly. They came up with online customer service skills as opposed to face-to-face. But they also came up with things like engineering skills, so software engineering skills to be able to build the website. They came up with data science skills to be able to analyze the data. And what they were then able to do is to go to the next level and say, okay, well, we've got those capabilities. These are the skills we need to deliver those capabilities. And then they were able to say, okay, well, this is what we think we've got today. This is what we now know that we're going to need in the future. We've got our gap, and we can therefore develop our strategies of, do we think we can train people internally to deliver those new capabilities? Do we need to short-term recruit people to bring those skills in? Do we need to actually bring in permanent employees because we just need to buy in some extra skills that we don't have? So in terms of the taxonomy, that's where the tech can really help. But in terms of understanding where best to use that and how to get the business value, that's where HR and the business have to work together and model that based on what you're trying to achieve. That's how I see the best organizations doing it. Yeah,
I mean, we're going back to the idea, which is really fundamental to HR today, but the idea of business partnering. You start with a business need and then work backwards to find it. Back to your point earlier, you were mentioning that skills such as, softer skills such as emotional intelligence, resilience, leadership were becoming increasingly important. Do you see technology, well, when you're doing this taxonomy and leveraging technology to put that kind of skills bank, so to say, is technology enabling us to identify this? Is this something that organizations need, or HR, the human side working with the machine, needs to think about and add manually? How does it actually work? How do we measure the skills?
Yeah, so in terms of once you've got your skills catalog, if you like, obviously the first bit is to try and understand where you are as an organization in terms of the skills you have. And here we see technology being able to really help in terms of enabling employees much more easily to interchange data they have in different places. So I'm sure you're the same as I am, in that in many ways you maintain your LinkedIn profile more than you would maintain your internal HR profile. So one of the areas we've seen a real evolution in is the ability for candidates when they first apply to an organization, or employees when they're established, being able to continually update their internal HR profile with those skills that are coming from the likes of LinkedIn, and giving employees that simple place to update it. Now, what you're also then able to do is to really take those skills and as an organization begin to match those to the opportunities that exist in the organization based on that capability review that you've done. So it could be that the organization can begin to use AI, for example, to make recommendations about what kind of learning you might like to do. If you're, for example, in a talent pool that has identified you as a future leader, that might then drive the recommended learning. There might be a whole bunch of other things. You know, people like to learn in really different ways these days, don't they? So it's not necessarily just going on a course or watching a video. You know, the recommendation could be, you know, go and do a short-term gig somewhere, go and try something different. It might be some organizations I've seen recently in terms of delivering skills are actually suggesting certain roles have been identified as having the opportunity for you to act up a level. So I was working with a media company recently, and they have actually introduced a formal scheme where they identify 100 roles each year, where if you're in that role, for example, you might be, I don't know, a camera operator, and you get the opportunity to be the assistant director for a certain number of episodes. Just to work out whether you have the skills and that's an interest. So there are so many different ways now that you can develop the skills and collect those skills. And for me, it's always that coming together of technology gives you the capability to store and to almost like sort of reverse things from the underlying data. So AI engines that are really good can start to suggest different things. But there's always be that human element of needing to link what you're doing to what you're actually trying to achieve. You know, what career paths are you trying to enable for your people? What skills do you need in the future so that HR can then deliver those capabilities that are needed at the higher level? So it all sort of comes together, really, if you like.
Yeah, and I think it's a really, really important point that you make here, and I hope that's coming through for everybody. It's really the partnership between technology and humans. It's not replacing what we do. It's enhancing where we have gaps, but then you need that partnership between the team and the technology to be able to feed the right data and inform the process, which I know is a recent webinar we've had, but around human versus machines, and there is that fear. But from what you're telling me, it's really more of a collaboration and being able to do things better. So if I understand correctly what you've said, and please tell me if I'm fully summarizing. So you start with the business outcome that you're trying to achieve. Well, HR should do that, which means you first need, and I'm going back to a comment that we've had, obviously that implies that HR first needs to have these conversations with the business, with the senior leadership team, and where you're trying to go, and that partnership element is really, really important. Then you need to have the technology help you, well, it's best if you have the technology helps you create kind of this skill taxonomy, where you were suggesting to take publicly available data around your industry, around, I suppose, salary or anything that's out there, or reports of future skills you might be needing, as well as the data that you have internally, which, again, if I understand correctly, that could be anything from a JD or an assignment, learning opportunity, report, or a 360 review, or anything that you have around the data, the skills that you need. And then you need So that's the kind of first step, is creating this map. And then you would need to have, and that's what you were just saying, which I thought was really interesting when I asked you the question about the soft skills. It seems that it's also a two-way street. So it's not just the organization uploading data, but also potentially candidates and individuals being able to show what skills they have and upload their profile or update their profile.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think a skills agenda doesn't work unless you bring your employees with you. You know, we've all been in that situation. I think, you know, if you look back over the last 5 or 10 years where we've been asked by our organizations to put skills in and we've had them verified in some way, or, you know, our managers have somehow tested us as to whether we've really got those skills. But I think, you know, increasingly it's really important to be able to upload them, but to understand and see evidence of how those skills are then going to be used, and that there's something in it for me. I mean, you know, it's lovely to tell your company you've got 10 skills. It's even nicer to tell them and then see job opportunities, or, you know, gig opportunities, or mentors, or all these other things that can help you develop as both as a person, but also as your skills, you know, start to be proactively pushed out. So there is a huge bit, Charlotte, I think, around bringing your employees with you, but doing that in a way where they can see the value, as well as feeling as if the organization value, you know, gets value as well. Because if it's a win-win, then chances are that'll engender a cultural change, and everybody will then start to feed off this and understand that in this particular organization, if I put in the effort to develop my skills, then I will see something at the end of it to reward me, rather than feeling like I have to go and walk out the door and go and take those newly acquired skills somewhere else in order to use them, which is often the worst answer for both sides of it. You know, I think when people leave, often it's it can quite often be with a heavy heart, because they just don't see the opportunity, and they get offered an opportunity elsewhere that just seems to be the one that they're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the element of culture change that you're talking about, which I know in our first call, we talked a lot about employee engagement and employee experience. So previously customers were number one, now your employees are number one, and they're your primary stakeholder. And like any change program, if you are to implement technology or you are to revise the skills that are going to be needed in the future, they need to be taken with you. And I think the second point, which is really important, is we've talked about data and the importance of bringing data. But you told me the first time that, yes, you need that AI and that technology to do things. But again, back to the partnership, the tech can't work out what your real gaps are, what the future skills are going to be. It's only going to show up historical data. So you also need to be able to have that constant input, and then to have the discussions. So I think when we talk about data, we really imagine a bunch of numbers and dashboards that we're showing to the company. But the engagement part, whether starting with the leadership buy-in and ending with the leadership buy-in and the employees following you, is really to make that data talk as well, and have the senior leadership walk the talk and use data and show what impact this is having. I see a few comments, which is quite interesting. I see a few comments from people that are saying, well, the existing workforce can be upskills with training and cross-training and mentoring and coaching, etc. It doesn't have to be external hiring. And I'll let you take that comment, but I think the first thing is definitely a big part of what you're saying is precisely in order to identify where there is potential that can be upgraded. It's not necessarily, the outcome is not necessarily firing people or hiring external talent, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely, totally. And most organizations, I think, if you're looking at a strategic plan, whether that's a plan for 12 months or, 2 or 3 years, most organizations are looking for a blend where the majority of the evolution they're looking to do will be upskilling and retraining and kind of really enabling their existing workforce. But again, it's back to this idea that it needs to be the data and it needs to be the knowledge of what skills people have and what you're going to need that really informs that. So it shouldn't just be a gut feeling that, we've got a group of 20 people over here and they seem like good people and we'd like to develop them. It needs to be a little bit more scientific than that. But I use that word loosely because what I'm not saying is I don't think HR need to become a whole bunch of data scientists. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that HR and actually the whole organization just need to become a bit more data literate and be able to work alongside data scientists and understand the language a little bit and understand what the data is telling them. But absolutely, I mean, a strategy that says you've just got to go lock, stock and barrel and recruit a whole bunch of people from outside is probably undervaluing the people you have in the organization. And it's not probably identifying clearly enough the development opportunities there are. And especially at the moment, I mean, I do a lot of work around diversity and inclusion. And I think one of the things that has really come out of the last 2 or 3 years and the heightened awareness of the importance of equality and inclusion is that need and that desire in a lot of boardrooms now, I think, to make sure that everyone in the organization feels that there's an equal access to opportunities. And again, it's an area where I think technology can really help because, you know, everybody can develop skills and everyone can have access to different vacancies and opportunities through technology. That's a very fair way of doing it. And I think, you know, that whole area of being able to ensure that when you identify people who have potential, that you can give everybody that equal chance to develop themselves and to bring in their, you know, authentic selves and just unlock that creativity that every team typically has, I think is something that comes into the melting pot when you're coming up with this overall strategy of what are we going to do about skills and how is that skills agenda then going to feed into those business outcomes that we've been talking about.
Thank you. And thank you for raising the question of diversity and inclusion because it's already been raised in the chat, which I'm quite delighted about. It means that it's still on top of everybody's minds. There are two sides to this, I guess. The first one is you're talking about equal opportunities, which is the foundation of having a diverse and inclusive workforce. And in that, my question is, how can your technology really support in doing this? And the question which is linked to, guess, is the other side of the coin, is we've heard a lot about, well, not so recently, and I suppose progress has been made, but we have heard quite a few stories around technology actually being biased against having a diverse and inclusive workforce. And I'm saying this because we've just talked about the fact that technology is being fed historical data. So if historically you've had a not so inclusive and diverse workforce, you've had a minority of women or a minority of people of color or whatnot, is it likely that it's going to identify potential candidates as not being so diverse? And so I guess my question is, where are you around this and how do you think that can be better for the future and really, really support what we're trying to do, I guess, all of us?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole conversation around bias is a really interesting one, a very important one. I think the early kind of attempts to use technology for things like better candidate matching, for example, didn't really think broadly enough about the impact of that historical data. So as you say, you know, if you have an organization that traditionally has always recruited, you know, men into a particular role, and you feed that into the AI engine without stripping away some of that, then almost inevitably you're going to get that bias. But what we've done certainly at Oracle, and I know other vendors have done it as well, I think this is a general market push to make sure that, you know, that bias doesn't come through, is, you know, our AI engine, for example, in recruitment, strips out all that personally identifiable information. So when it's making the recommendations, it's based much more on the skills and the experience and the types of jobs people have done, and not on, you know, what gender are they, what's their ethnic background, what age are they, that sort of stuff. So I think if you get the right algorithms and the right AI engines, then you can feed in historical data. You can potentially allow HR to tweak the sort of, if you like, the priority that different bits of data are given. And then the AI engine can make recommendations on the back of that. But it's going back to your point really, Charlotte, I suppose, about that synergy between technology and the human element. For me, I know a lot of organizations on the recruitment side are going for kind of full automation and, you know, trying to make it touchless at certain parts. But I think there's still an important role for that sort of oversight of what's the technology actually doing, and is it doing what we really want it to do, and is it embracing the cultures and the values that we as an organization want to promote, and the type of people with the skills who we want to bring in. So, you know, don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of technology supporting, but I'm not a massive advocate of just leaving it to do its own thing and not keeping that clear oversight of what the outcome is. And I think that's a lot of what happens in bias. To your first sort of question about equality of opportunity and how technology helps. I think a lot of what technology can do actually is make opportunities visible in a way that it hasn't in the past. So I know a lot of organizations now are allowing their employees, for example, to go onto some kind of digital assistant or a chatbot and ask about different vacancies and get kind of answers. So there's a lot you can do around visibility of data and opportunity, about creating a culture that makes everybody feel as if they've got a chance. So, that whole area of having role models, part of your skills agenda, in my opinion, needs to be having role models and having people in sort of visible places in the organization that anybody lower down looks at them and thinks, well, yeah, that's me. I can see myself in them. And therefore I feel like I can take that leap. And then creating that culture that says, if I do apply, the application will be based on my skills and my capabilities, not where I'm from or who I am. And I think it's that marrying of technology, human intervention, culture, and everything that creates those deep rooted cultural changes and creates a much more inclusive way of doing things. And, I don't think probably no organization's getting it 100% right, but there's an awful lot of organizations doing a lot better now than they were 2 or 3 years ago because of external events raising so much more awareness of the importance of basing things on skills and not necessarily on people, for example, recruiting someone who looks like me. So it's a really interesting area, I think.
It is definitely interesting, and I think we could have an entire webinar on this, but I also think it's really refreshing to hear somebody from a technology company talk about skills like that. I think the kind of stigma around, having somebody from Oracle talk is that you're going to talk to us through data and numbers and figures, and that it doesn't necessarily have that element. But all I'm hearing is the fact that, yes, technology can take you so far, but that there is that human element that you need to add to it. And you're talking about DNI, you're talking about role models. I think that's, really beyond. It's, yes, start with the data, end with the data, use it to make a case, but still have a robust strategy behind it. And bear in mind, not just the business objectives, but also what you're trying to do more broadly in terms of employer branding, in terms of your overall strategy. So thank you for that.
It's funny actually that I think technology, if used well, allows HR to become an innovation center and unlocks the creativity in HR itself. So, designing those moments that matter for employees and designing a skills agenda that works for the organization and the individual. If you have the technology layer in place that does the heavy loading and does the AI bits well, HR people suddenly can be, almost unlocked to really think about, how do we want this HR service to be delivered to our employees? How do we want them to engage with it? And as a result, if we get the better data, how can we then drive those business outcomes? So yeah, it does all sort of fit together, and technology is a part of it. But I suppose my whole background has not been so much the pure technology, but it's been what can technology do to help us achieve what we're trying to achieve. And that's, I think, in the skills agenda is a really important thing to keep in mind.
Absolutely, and I see time is going very fast, so I'll try and squeeze in 2 more questions. Please, if you have any further questions for Caroline or points that I haven't delved into that you wish I had, please submit them through the chat. So the first quick question I want to ask you is, we're talking about HR leading this adoption of technology and being able to embed it in their processes. What I see with the CIPD is that often I would call it technological literacy. It's not necessarily always the best. And it's quite challenging for HR to ask the right questions. And I say this all the time through courses that we offer, how do you choose a provider? What are the right questions that you need to ask? How do you know this technology is doing what you need it to know? So I guess, well, do you feel that HR has the right literacy, or do you almost help them out as well with a choice? And what would be your first recommendation to HR who feels like they don't know where to start, who agree with everything that you're saying, but just feel lost in the maze of choices?
Yeah, so I think HR departments are understanding that they themselves need to develop new skills. So I think there are the data literacy skills, there are the slightly more technical skills. But what I would say is that the HR departments I see that work really well is a mix of people who I would call the kind of more traditional HR people who are interested in, more kind of policy and, that some of those areas, and then a new kind of type of HR person almost that has come up through that more data literacy side of things. And where it works really well is where different skill sets can teach each other and work together on particular projects. So, if you're an HR person who hasn't particularly come from a data or a technology background, undoubtedly there will be some work to do in terms of doing some training, but there's also that ability to work alongside people in specific projects and to gain by that sort of experience-led way of doing things. And what you'll find in a lot of analytics platforms, and obviously Oracle's an example, but again, there are lots of other ones as well that do the same, is this concept of a citizen data scientist. Now, the concept there is that if you're in HR, you're never going to be a full data scientist. You're not going to go off and learn statistical models and do all of that. And you've probably got no interest in writing any code or anything like that. But like you say, what you need to be able to do is to ask the right question. And so there's a level of responsibility on you, I suppose, to get to that level where you understand the questions to ask. But there's also a responsibility on the data and the technology side for people to be able to explain to you what's happening in a way that you can understand and make decisions. And I talk a lot to customers I work with about how do you create a group of skills in HR that allow you to take advantage of the technology and what's possible, but to bring everyone with you who maybe doesn't have that background. And as I say, I think it's something you need to really consider as an HR department of how you're going to gain that. I mean, there's talk, I know I was listening to Josh Burson the other day on one of his podcasts, and he was talking a little bit about the idea of a full stack HR person who can sort of do everything. They can, they can understand the technology, they can do the data analysis, they can work out the policy, they can do everything. Now, it's quite rare, I think, that you're going to find someone who has that full range of skills. So instead, what you need to do is to get that range of skills in HR, recognize you need them, but bring them together in a way that people feel comfortable. I mean, HR is no different to any other part of the organization, is it? Ultimately, everybody needs to understand, I'm here, I need to get to there, and this is how I'm going to get there, and this is what help I need. So it's that same thing. So in terms of starting, I think you start by understanding where you need to be. You potentially do a little bit of training just to get some of the terminology and stuff, because all things have their language of their own. But then it's about working as an HR team and making sure that you've got all the right skills coming together, I think, in a more fluid way than maybe traditionally we have.
Great. Thank you for always having these comprehensive answers. Well, I guess you've talked about the fact that there are many other providers and that there are many solutions. But I'd like to ask about yours, because when we first talked about, now that we've kind of gone into the process that goes into choosing your technology, what it can do for you, the impact and skills agenda, I'm quite interested generally to know, what does your technology at Oracle actually do? I guess in a nutshell, first of all, what does it do, and how do you work with clients on that? And there's a question that I asked you offline, but I think a lot of the time, again, when we think about technology providers, we think of that kind of one-way push thing. You guys have a very commercial marketing machine, well-engineered marketing machine, which can sometimes kind of scare HR off or businesses off. How do you, so we'll talk about your solutions, and then I'm curious to know how you work with organizations. Do you tailor, do you partner with them? Do you, consult them on the creation of the technology? Or is it really, like we think, a one-way street?
Okay, so in a nutshell, our solution is an enterprise HR solution. So we have technology that covers the entire life cycle from hire to retire. We focus very strongly on user experience. So we recognize that everything needs to be mobile these days. It needs to be simple. So our solution is very much tailored towards employees and managers being able to do more for themselves where it's simple for them to do so, but then being able to easily ask for help. So things like help desk or online policy documents, things like that. In terms of the specific skills agenda that we've been talking about today, we have three key capabilities, which very briefly, we've got something called the skills nexus, which we touched on earlier, which is this AI-driven engine to create your skills catalog and to keep that up to date with the data that you feed into it. Secondly, we've got something called the skills advisor, which is the piece that takes that skills catalogue, takes the skills that we know employees have, and makes all of the intelligent recommendations and suggestions for learning, or, you know, a new placement or a mentor. And then the third bit is what we call the skills center, which is where employees and managers can go and see what skills they have. And obviously wrapped around that sort of dynamic skills is all of the stuff you'd expect around talent reviews and succession planning and being able to manage the risk to the business if you don't have the skills you need. I think in terms of how we as an organization work, I have to be honest, we've changed dramatically the last 3 or 4 years. So I think if you'd come to Oracle HR 4 or 5 years ago, we probably would have been very similar to the other vendors and been desperate to show you a demo and show you some screens and probably bore you to death with 100 slides. We're very different now, and anyone on the call who wants to just have a conversation with us, we always start now by just having a general conversation about what are you trying to achieve as an HR department? How's that going to link into your business outcomes? Just trying to really understand what your priorities are. And then really the team I'm in, our role is to really translate the technology side of Oracle into examples and value-added stories that mean something to you as an HR person. So you said earlier on, Charlotte, that technology kind of scares HR people, and that's totally understandable. It's got its own language. So really my role, and everybody in my team, our role is to take that fear away and to explain how technology can help you deliver the job you've got without you necessarily having to understand everything about how the technology is actually working under the covers, because there's probably other people in the organization who are more interested in the nuts and bolts. For me, I'm interested in how will that help you as an HR department deliver your people strategy.
Great, thank you for that. We've got about 10 minutes left, so if any of you agrees or disagrees with Caroline or with I, or you got questions or comments, please do pop them right here through the chat. And meanwhile, there is one area which we have talked about offline, you and I, Caroline, which we haven't talked about today, but I guess it's kind of the bonus round. And I'm quite interested to go into that. So we've talked about earlier, you've talked about the human side of collaborating with technology, and also more the human element when we were talking about diversity and inclusion. We've had a discussion earlier around mental health and mental health side of technology, not just of technology actually, but also of this ever-changing environment where employees have had to change skills really, really fast. And somebody said, well, one of the new skills that we've had to develop is technology. And I think that's true. And I can say, you know, at the CIPD, our executive TA to the CEO, she's over 70 years old, and she's had to learn how to organize and use technology in ways that she probably never thought she did, because previously we would have thought it was young people to do that. So what can you comment or caveat around the mental health side of this transformation?
Yeah, so I think the whole mental health side of things, it was already a big issue even before the last couple of years. I think if you look at the statistics for the proportion of people being off work, mental health was right at the top in terms of the reason that people weren't at work, even before the last couple of years. I think one of the great things that technology can do is in a situation where someone has to work remotely, is I think technology can do a really good job at making sure that that person feels connected, making sure that they have a space where they can share how they're feeling. So I've certainly seen it within Oracle from my own experience, is that we've all got to know each other slightly better in a funny kind of way remotely. We've all got to know each other slightly better. We've seen our backgrounds, we've seen our children and our dogs and the postman doing his deliveries and everything. And I think what that's engendered is the ability to actually, on occasion, to be able to say, actually, I'm just not feeling great today. I'm just having a really tough day. And just to kind of talk that through. And what I've seen a lot of organizations do is to encourage their managers to just touch base, and it doesn't necessarily need to be through technology, it could just be a phone call with employees to say, you know, actually, how are things going? Let's forget about work for a minute. How are you? Do you have a safe space to work in? do you need to actually just come in and physically meet someone? Because actually that's just going to help you in terms of where you are emotionally. So I think there's been a lot on the sort of day-to-day of employees who've worked from home where technology's helped. I think the other area it can help is that kind of concern that you might have if you're going back into a workplace and you're not sure what you're going to find. I think we've seen a lot of organizations do amazing things with things like checklists of sort of videos and tasks and other things that they can do to prepare themselves. So maybe just providing a video that shows the new layout in the office, maybe providing some instructions about when they arrive, how it's going to be. You know, all of these things from a sort of nervousness and anxiety point of view can actually really help. Obviously, there's a lot more kind of deeper stuff that you can do. A lot of the employee assistance programs have really helped, and a lot of online sort of consultations with, you know, medical professionals and all that side of things. But I think in terms of the broader population, technology has been able, in a funny kind of way, to do quite a lot to connect people and make them still feel part of something. But I think we are getting to the point now, and I don't know how you're finding it in your organizations, but we're finding at Oracle that there's quite a lot of Zoom fatigue these days. And that, again, from a mental health point of view, it's important to balance how much people are expected to be online. And there's quite a lot of interesting research about how much more your brain has to work if you're online as opposed to face-to-face, because you don't have the face-to-face sort of physical things to look at to pick up people's moods and stuff. So, you know, there's a whole lot around that. I mean, like you say, that could probably be an hour on its own, couldn't it? But I think it's fascinating to see how much organizations are focused on this and really understand the importance of the mental health and well-being of their people, and bringing those people with them, whatever way they're working currently and however they're going to work going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Karen. I think it's quite also not surprising at all, but refreshing to know that technology companies as well are thinking about this. We sometimes see non-technology companies really encourage their employees to be online all the time, and I think to have that balance is really important. And obviously, mental health is something that we really advocate. We've got tons of reports on this, so if anyone is interested, please do go to CIPD Middle East or CIPD.ae. Well, that's been quite an insight-packed conversation. I hope it's been really helpful for everybody. And for me, what really stood out and really came across from Caroline's viewpoints was really the importance of working together with technology, but also really learning where to start if you are going to plan your workforce of the future. And I see a lot of organizations today asking us about workforce planning, succession planning, OD, and asking external sources what the skills of the future are going to be. Whereas what you're saying, Caroline, is yes, trust external sources and publicly available data, but also look inwards and see what your needs might be. And from there, you get to build from your own data, and you get to match it with the right recommendations. I also really take away how helpful technology is, and I don't think that's surprising. I don't think that's news to us, but it's important to be reminded that if you do work with it, it isn't a lie. It's far from being the monster that we've made up in our heads that's going to take our jobs. But on the contrary, really something that also enhances the quality of our work, and the outputs, and the business partnering. All right, there is a final question which I want to ask you, because I want to let Khaled hanging. But on the question of data, finally, and that'll be a quick one, but talking about organizations providing their own data, Khaled is asking us to what degree, and that goes back to the bias, I suppose, can an organization trust its own data? And how can an organization make sure that the data is not either manipulated, biased, or intentionally intentionally misinterpreted? What would be your say on this? Is there any way that we can safeguard our data and make sure that it's safe to use?
Yeah, so I think the extent to which you can trust data, there's quite a lot you can do now around sort of automated validation. So when you're collecting the data, there's quite a lot you can do around automating validations, auto-populating data based on other combinations of data that have been entered. and also in terms of reviewing the data. So the sort of real-time reporting you can get now can really help you to validate and make sure that you can trust the data. I think in terms of making sure that the data is used in the right way, a couple of quick things I would say is, first of all, I think a lot of that is about education. So the businesses that I see that are truly moving to a data-driven approach are doing a huge amount in terms of enabling their people to understand how to use data, to understand not to make kind of spurious correlations, for example, between bits of data that actually scientifically there's no correlation between. So there's a lot you can do around that. In terms of the whole sort of bias and that sort of area, I think a lot of what I said earlier is what I would say is make sure that when you're making decisions based on data, as far as possible, you remove the data that can create that bias and only focus on the core thing like the skills, for example. But ultimately, it is about making sure that sensitive data is in the hands of the right people with the right skills and training, and who are able to understand the power of what the data can tell them, but also potentially the pitfalls and try and avoid those. So there's a lot around education and experience that can really help.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Khaled, for the question. Thank you, everybody, for joining. So if anybody has questions about Oracle solutions or how we can partner together, I will drop the email in the chat. I have it here, sorry. I will drop an email for Aaron in HCM Solutions in the Middle East that can get in contact with you and have a conversation with you. Obviously, you can find further information on oracle.com/AE or just oracle.com. This is the first of a longer term collaboration with Oracle. So we will have other sessions around being data driven, analytics, partnering with the business skills. There is a whole agenda that even so many topics that we've touched on today that could have been an entire session of their own. They won't all be this format. We'll have panel discussions, etc. So we'll try to have an engaging conversation with you all. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did miss out on the beginning, you will be able to receive the recording. Meanwhile, thank you so much, Caroline, for being with us today. I really enjoyed our conversation. Is there any final words or something that you wanted to say that I haven't had the chance to cover?
No, just to say, if anyone wants to carry on the conversation, I'm on LinkedIn, so any of the attendees feel really free to reach out, and I'm always happy to have a conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And I know that we did ask everybody when you signed up if you were happy to receive news from Oracle, and probably many of you said no, but if you have changed your mind after hearing from Caroline, you can always reply to us by email or get in contact with via the contacts that we'll send you. Thank you so much. Have a great end of week, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.